This short presentation is about something that's intrigued me for a number of years. You may well recognise the gentleman in the portrait there. It's less likely you'd know quite why it was called the Chandos portrait. Let's have a look at it, see what we can see. What do we know then? What are the facts that we know about this portrait? We know it hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. We know its size. It's 21 3/4 by 17 1/4 inches. We know that it's painted on canvas with oil paint, and from paint analysis we can tell that it was probably painted between 1600 and 1610. Now it's really quite a good portrait, so it's a bit odd that it wasn't signed. Physically, the portrait is not in a very good state. If we look at an X-ray photograph of the portrait, you can quite clearly see the weave of the canvas. The earring stands out very clearly, as this was painted with a pigment called lead tin yellow, and as the white paint also contained lead, that too shows up very clearly. The X-ray also shows how badly the painting's been treated during its life. The red marks show where there were holes in the canvas which have been repaired. It's clearly been restored many times before it was donated to the National Portrait Gallery, and some restorers were perhaps a little over-enthusiastic. Analysis of the paint shows that his hair and beard have been enlarged at some point in its life. As you can see here, the grey areas. The paint used for these was quite different to that used for the original portrait. So what did it look like when it was first painted? The layer of paint is now very thin and abraded, particularly to the face and the collar. The painting's been over-varnished at least once during restorations, and that has darkened the whole image considerably. This image shows a tiny flake of paint which has been encapsulated in clear resin, then sliced in half and magnified, and this microscopic section shows the different layers of the painting. The grey underlayer is of course the canvas, the original paint layer, the oil paint there, and at the top you can see the varnish and the overpaint, and you can see quite how dark that is and how it's darkened the whole image. Cleaning a very small area on the forehead reveals what is left of the original colour. Just this tiny area was cleaned. And using a computer program, the effect of that cleaning over a larger area can be seen. And to show that in perspective, the whole image with part of the face cleaned by the computer. As you can see, it's just not such a swarthy, dark look. The same process applied to the area of the collar. Here before cleaning, there's so little paint left, mostly what you can see here is canvas. And again enlarged by that same computer program. And you can see there, full size, some of the original colour. But whose portrait is this? Is it William Shakespeare? There's an awful lot we don't know about Will Shakespeare, and what we take as fact is often contrived. For example, we all believe that Shakespeare was born on April the 23rd, 1564, but we don't know that for certain. All we do know for certain is that he was baptised on April the 26th. His birth date is assumed to be the 23rd because in those days of high infant mortality it was customary to baptise children swiftly, no later than the first Sunday or holy day following birth. In any event, Will Shakespeare would have been in his mid-40s when this portrait was painted, and that sort of fits, as this chap looks to be in his 40s. The other question we have to answer is who painted the portrait? Knowing who the artist was might clarify who the subject was. Some believe that Richard Burbage painted this image. He was an actor, friend and business associate of Shakespeare, and also a painter in his spare time. This is a self-portrait. But Burbage seems unlikely. The portrait is just not at all in his style. There was a painter who knew Shakespeare quite well, a chap called John Taylor. That is, if it's the same John Taylor who was a child actor with the Children of St Paul's, a well-known acting troupe in the 1590s. We know that Shakespeare knew them as they're mentioned in his play Hamlet, so it's very likely that Shakespeare and Taylor had met. Taylor was clearly a good artist. He went on to become a significant figure in the Painter and Stainers Company, rising to become master of the company in 1643. You can see him on the right in this 1631 picture. But despite this, no painting by John Taylor is known to exist. If you should look for paintings by John Taylor, you will find only one attributed, not known to be, just attributed to him, which is the Chandos portrait. But he is associated with dozens of others, for everyone who's ever wanted to paint a portrait of William Shakespeare since then has copied Taylor's original. T.H. Ellis, mid-19th century. Sir George Sharp, 1886. Samuel Cousins, 1849. Robert Cooper, 1864-ish. Richard Austin Arklett, 1860-ish. An engraving by John Hall, 1785. John Goldar, also 1785. James Heath, 1822. We don't know the date and we don't know who the painter was, but it's clearly a copy of the original. Shakespeare was so popular that in 1923 he even appeared on a cigarette card. I suppose the target market might have been players. There's one more copy that we really ought to look at, and this very fine engraving was made by George Vertue. Vertue was the leading engraver of the 17th century. This is a self-portrait. He had a deep interest in antiquarian portrait research. He came across the John Taylor portrait in 1719, about 100 years after it was painted, and he traced the history of the portrait, and it's his work that gives us the best reasons to believe that this is a portrait of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's wife and children lived in Stratford-upon-Avon, but his working life was in the London theatres, and whilst living in London he met a chap called John Davenant, who was a merchant vintner. Sometime around 1600, Davenant and his wife Jane sold up in London and moved to Oxford, where he took over the Salutation Tavern, later known as the Crown, at 3 Cornmarket, Oxford. As you can see, it's now a shop. Oxford lies about halfway on the direct route from London to Stratford-upon-Avon, so it was a convenient overnight stop when Shakespeare was travelling to New Place, his Stratford house. Shakespeare naturally stayed at his friend's tavern. In 1604, Jane Davenant, said to be of a great beauty and have a sprightly wit, had a son, whom she named William, and Shakespeare became his godfather. Although never proven, it was commonly believed that Shakespeare and Jane Davenant were, shall we say, romantically linked, so it's entirely possible that he was perhaps just a little bit more than a godfather. William Davenant certainly grew up believing he was Shakespeare's son, and he saw himself carrying on his father's legacy, becoming a successful playwright and a poet himself, and eventually was made Poet Laureate in 1638. He was a man of some means, and he owned the Duke's Theatre at Lincoln's Inn Field, and indeed is buried in Westminster Abbey. George Vertue believed that the artist John Taylor left the portrait to William Davenant in his will, perhaps believing that he was Shakespeare's son. It was bought from Davenant by Thomas Betterton. Now, Betterton was a leading actor-manager of his day, and he knew Davenant as when he was younger he'd been apprenticed to Davenant's publisher, John Holden. Betterton died intestate, and the picture was bought by Robert Keck, a lawyer and keen collector of Shakespeare memorabilia. After Keck's death in 1719, it passed to his daughter Winifred, who married John Nicol of Minchendon House, Colney Hatch. Nicol's daughter Margaret married James Bridges, 3rd Duke of Chandos. Margaret died, and 10 years later James Bridges was remarried to Anne Eliza Gammon, and they had a daughter, Anne Elizabeth Bridges, who in 1796 married Richard Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos Grenville, and so the painting arrived at Stowe House. It doesn't appear in the 1798 guidebook, possibly because it was still at the Bridges estate at Avington, near Winchester. It's listed in the 1817 guidebook as being hung in the state closet. It's a small room within the state bedchamber or garter room, which we know today as the servery, where it was to stay for the next 71 years until 1848, when life went terribly wrong for the family and all their belongings were sold at auction, the painting being acquired by the Earl of Ellesmere for 355 guineas. Ellesmere donated it to the National Portrait Gallery in 1856 to start their collection. So that's the probable story of the Chandos portrait. There is one more engraving we could look at. Even though he was very popular, Shakespeare's plays were not published as a volume during his lifetime. Some 7 years after he died, two of his friends, both actors, John Hemmings and Henry Cordell, gathered together what actor scripts they could and published a collection of Shakespeare's play as one volume, which became known as the First Folio. Now, bear in mind that the actor's scripts had only then the actor's speech with the previous 2 lines as a cue. They may have had a prompt book which contained all the speeches, but that would be heavily annotated with stage directions and all the other data needed for a performance as well. But this seems unlikely, since almost no stage directions were included in the folio, the exception of course being the improbable exit pursued by a bear in A Winter's Tale. When Hemmings and Cordell got them to the printers, the scripts were set in type ready for the printing press. Careful analysis leads us to believe that this task was completed by 5 different compositors, each with different spelling and punctuation habits and levels of competence. In all probability, they are not exactly what Shakespeare wrote. Nevertheless, that's what they published, and to catch the eye of the potential purchaser, Hemmings and Cordell wanted a picture of Shakespeare to put on the front of their book. But in 1623, the only way you could print a picture was to use an engraving, so they commissioned a chap called Martin Droeshout to make one. And this is what he produced. Droeshout was 14 or 15 when Shakespeare died. How then did he know what Shakespeare looked like? Watch his eyes carefully. As you can see, Droeshout, never having met Shakespeare, also copied the John Taylor image. Martin Droeshout was a member of a Flemish family of engravers who had come to live in England to avoid persecution for their Protestant beliefs. He was 22 when he engraved this image. It's the earliest known of his works, but it's likely he was already an established engraver. He came from an artistic family. His father and older brother were engravers, and his uncle was an established artist. Despite being the best-known playwright in the world, Shakespeare the man is a bit of a mystery. The only facts we have are those recorded officially: baptism, marriage, death, the names of his children as they were baptized. The only samples of his handwriting is "by me" on his will. There are 6 examples of his signature. Each has a different spelling, and none of them matches the spelling we use today. And the mystery continues with the engraving we see here. The head is too large for the body. His right eye is positioned higher than the left, and it's larger. His hair is longer on the left side, and he seems to have no neck, yet his head is too high. He looks much better like this, but it still doesn't look right. That's because his doublet is nonsense. The 2 front panels are of 2 different shapes and sizes. His left-hand panel is wider at the base than the right one, and it curves down below the sleeve, widening at the bottom, whereas the right panel narrows at the base. The shoulder wings are of different sizes. They even look a different type. There is an answer to this, but it really only deepens the mystery. In 1911, a tailor who'd studied the engraving realised that the right-hand side of the doublet is clearly a view of the back of the left-hand side. Careful study of the embroidery shows that the pattern would match. So, this is therefore a man with two left arms? It shows great detail in the work and is skillfully executed. Any artist will tell you you're only as good as your last portrait or engraving. There can be no doubt that Droeshout, wanting his family to be proud of him, took a lot of trouble with this work. It was, after all, of a very famous subject. He was satisfied with the result. He signed it. Hemmings and Cordell, who commissioned the engraving, must have approved it, as they put it on the front of their collection of Shakespeare's plays. Thus, it's only reasonable to believe that Droeshout engraved what he was told to engrave. Hemmings and Cordell were paying him, so told him what they wanted. But why did Shakespeare have two left arms? It's another mystery. To be sure, there's more of a mystery about the Droeshout engraving than the Chandos painting, but all that I've said today is, perhaps educated and informed, guesswork. The only facts we know are: this portrait hangs in the National Gallery. Its size is 21 3/4 by 17 1/4 inches. It's oil paint on canvas, and it's probably painted between 1600 and 1610.